I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for Dr. Vernon's presentation on providing us with a primer about clinical trials. This will hopefully help us as we move into clinical trials now and also in the future. And these are things that we're hoping everybody can learn from in language that we can become familiar with in order to make you informed and empowered advocates for your son and know what questions to ask or what you can ask, and to be familiar with language that is commonly used. Dr. Vernon, we appreciate you joining us and leading this discussion this evening, and go ahead and take it away.
Okay, good. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Shelley?
I sure can.
Great. Well, thanks for everybody for joining on a late Thursday evening. So what I'm going to be discussing today is general information on the clinical trials process in the United States. And I can't discuss any specific trials, either ongoing or those that are coming up, because as we'll discuss, the IRB process for different institutions rightfully really wants to manage information that's coming from studies to make sure that it's not represented in any way that would bias patients or cause any undue stress on families. So what I'm going to discuss tonight is an overview. So for sure, there's going to be details that I'm not going to be able to squeeze in. There are just pages and pages and pages of information, just primers on clinical trials. But if there are any specific questions, if I can't answer it tonight, then please email me or call me and I will find out the answer for you. And at the end, I'll also give some resources. So I'm going to briefly review what the preclinical process is, and that's basically how either, I'll be referring mostly to drugs, but these are processes that also apply to different medical devices as well. So it's a similar process. So what goes on before a drug or a device ever reaches a human being, and that's what goes on in a laboratory and what will go on in cell and animal studies. Then if something gets through a preclinical process, it then comes to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that really oversees and directs a stepwise trial and approval process, and also ongoing engagement throughout the trial and approval process and afterwards as well for long-term engagement. And then as well as what goes on in the FDA, there are separate approval and oversights that go on at every study site. So this is where a clinical trial will take place. And these things include an institutional review board, and I'll discuss their roles with you, a site initiation visit, and a very important group of people called a data safety and monitoring board. So what exactly is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are conducted to assess two things: safety and effectiveness of the new medicine or of a new device. And there are several stages in the clinical trial process before a medicine can reach final approval. And each phase is considered to be a completely separate trial. So at the completion of each phase, researchers and investigators are required to submit that data from that phase to the FDA, and it has to be reviewed for whatever endpoints for safety before any approval can be given to move on to the next phase. So there are a number of purposes for clinical trials. And the first one is probably the most obvious, and that's to obtain FDA approval for a new drug or procedure or device, or to obtain a new indication for an established drug. So in other words, if a drug already is used to treat one condition, the FDA process would need to be completed again if you wanted to market that drug or device for a completely separate condition. But clinical trials can also be used to compare two separate treatments to see if they have equal effect. Clinical trials can be used to evaluate biomarkers for a disease, or to actually help determine the natural history of a disease that might help improve sort of how a condition progresses over time and what causes that condition to progress. And the important thing to recognize that every step along the way prior to approval for any of these indications is considered to be research. So, what are some other important things to know about clinical trials is that, again, as I mentioned, the goals are safety first, absolutely, and effectiveness second. Only about 1 in 1,000 investigational drugs, and that's from the preclinical phase to the approval, will actually make it to human trials. And only about 10 to 15% of clinical trials across the board will eventually get approval. This is because there are various reasons why drugs might not reach approval, and that's if it doesn't work, if there's safety concerns. There's actually sometimes drugs can't get approval if there's just practical difficulties in manufacturing a drug or things that make that drug untenable for the population. And as I mentioned, each individual step is assessed, and the decision is made with the FDA about whether or not a trial can progress. And sometimes these processes can take 10 to 15 years to get from preclinical to marketing. So this is something I thought was really important to address prior to getting into a little bit more detail about clinical trials. So when we talk about clinical trials, we're talking about drugs and not supplements. And I thought it was important to really think about the two as separate entities, because particularly in rare diseases, it's very easy to sort of mix the two terms because of the way that we work with and treat our patients. But the thing to note is that supplements, by definition, are not tested by the FDA. They are defined by the FDA as products taken orally for supplementing the diet. So these are not intention to treat products. And these are things like herbs, minerals, vitamins, protein powders, amino acids, in fact, and other such products. These can come in pill form, powders, liquids. They can look just like a drug, but there's not FDA established standard doses. Production of supplements are typically self-regulated by the manufacturer, although there are some quality assurance companies out there that can help assign a level of quality assurance to some of these supplements. And the important thing to know is these supplements, there is no proof that is required to demonstrate that they work or have any function. This is something that's pretty much opposite of how drugs are reviewed. So drugs are tested by the FDA. They are substances that are intended to treat or prevent a disease, and they must successfully pass clinical trials, and safety must be proven before they can be prescribed, and they have to be manufactured in a regulated way. So you can see pretty clearly the difference between how we define a supplement and how we define a drug. And I just put this little picture up here to show that sometimes when you look at the way drugs and supplements are packaged, it can be very, very difficult to tell what is a drug and what is a supplement. So what I wanted to mention is if you simply turn a bottle over and look at the back and see one of these little supplement facts panels, which is required to be on bottles if they're following regulatory rules, you would know that that in fact is a supplement and not something that has been regulated by the FDA or had a proven efficacy as approved by the FDA. So I want to review some terminology, and these are some words that I think will just be helpful to know. They're going to come up in many, many trials that come down the pike for Barth syndrome and other conditions, and so I just wanted to sort of give you some tools to be able to approach and understand some of these trials. So the principal investigator is the person who takes responsibility for the safety and actions of a clinical trial going on at a specific site. If there are more than one study site for a clinical trial, there can be a principal investigator at each site, but that's the person, again, who accepts responsibility for the study team and the actions of that team at the site. The study coordinator is typically not a person with medical education, not a medical practitioner, but a person who is educated in carrying out clinical trials and works with the study team to put together all the administrative aspects of the study. So these are invaluable people who do things like coordinate scheduling, contact families to see if they have any questions, help with any questions that come up with drug compliance, anything like that. So these are people who really are our problem solvers. The next term that will come up frequently is IND. This is an investigational new drug. So this is essentially how you would refer to a study product that's being trialed before a study drug before it's trialed, while it's being trialed, excuse me, before it reaches FDA approval. As I mentioned, a DSMB. This is a Data Safety and Monitoring Board. And these are a group of people who are appointed independent of a clinical trial who assess safety data as the trial goes on, just to make sure there's nothing concerning that needs to be questioned about any of the safety and health of the participants. So again, an independent monitoring board that's really designed to monitor for participant safety. And I want to discuss a little bit about what placebo-controlled means. So the vast majority of studies out there, drug studies, will undergo a phase that is placebo-controlled. And what this does is it tests the effectiveness of a treatment or an IND against something that looks like the treatment but has no active ingredients. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the placebo effect, and it's a very real thing. So when people, when individuals take a substance that they perceive to be a medication, they can physically feel better. And sometimes that can be something that's very difficult to tell from the effect of a drug. And so the way we do that is to, at the same time, look at a drug and a placebo and see what the differences are in the reaction to that, the act of taking a perceived medication. And the next term is double-blinded. This is an interesting one. So most or the vast majority of placebo-controlled studies in early phases are double-blinded. And this means that neither the researcher or the research team nor the participant in the study, so the person taking the drug, actually knows if they're receiving the drug or the placebo. And this way, it prevents the researcher from doing anything to favor a positive outcome in their drug, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, and also prevents the participant in the study who's taking the drug to be able to sort of, again, favor if they're having improved outcomes for that drug. And again, please stop me if any questions are coming up. I feel like I'm motoring through this a little bit, and I want to make sure that this is clear to everybody. Are all drug studies double-blinded? No, they're not all double-blinded. There can be different study designs, but the sort of the gold standard of mid-phase trials, if they can be done, again, it depends on the limitations of the study, but the gold standard really is a placebo-controlled double-blinded study. Sometimes it's frankly just not possible based on what the drug and the disease is. Okay, so what is a preclinical study? So preclinical studies are essentially everything that goes on in the laboratory before a drug or a product will see a human being. So these are all the things that go on in laboratories, and these are things that can take years and years and years, and this includes discovery, in other words, discovering what a compound might be, trying to understand how that compound might work, and then looking at the effect not in humans, but in different models, such as animals or cells. This can involve years of experiments and modeling, and some important things have to happen in these preclinical studies before a drug can ever be considered to be tested in a human being. And again, a lot of these really involve safety, 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 and that's something I'm going to keep emphasizing over and over again. It's a real focus of the FDA, and it should be a focus of anyone conducting a clinical trial. So toxicology studies, looking at the drug itself. It might have the effect you want in a good way, but does it have an effect you want in a bad way? So all things that new drugs have to be studied for is, can it cause cancer? Can it change the sequence of DNA? That's something we call a mutagen. Is it something that could potentially be harmful in pregnancy? And another thing that needs to be understood is what's called pharmacokinetics, and that is, how is this compound broken down in the body? Is it something that someone takes and then it sits in their body for the rest of their life and accumulates, or is it something that comes out of the body so quickly it can't possibly have an effect? Or another question is, do different people break that drug down differently, and you need to be considerate of how doses would vary from person to person. And if and only if all of these aspects of the preclinical studies are successful and show appropriate results, can researchers send the data to the FDA for consideration for approval to initiate research and testing in humans. So you can see how important it is that all these things happen and happen properly beforehand, and why it is that so few compounds actually ever make it to the FDA for even initial testing. So at that point, once a compound or a drug has met all of the preclinical requirements, what the researchers can then do is apply for an IND. This is an investigational new drug application. And the IND I put here, put these pictures of little ducks because this is the part where it's really important for the researchers to get all of their ducks in a row in order for the FDA to even consider approving an early stage clinical trial. So the things that the IND application must include information in several areas, and that is the aforementioned animal pharmacology and toxicology studies, again, to assess whether the drug is likely to be safe for testing in humans. The IND also needs to contain important information about the chemistry of the compound, what it looks like, what it's made of, and in fact, how it's made. They need to know whether it's possible to even manufacture this drug in the future. In other words, can it be made in a way that it's going to be stable that humans can take it? And can it be reproducibly manufactured with high quality? In other words, if you can only make it right 1 out of 10 times, then it's not something that's going to be approved to be seen in humans. Yeah, what is the question? Let's see. Is that the same as the half-life of a drug? Yes, so the half-life of a drug is certainly part of the pharmacokinetics. So again, how long it takes for the drug to come out of the body. And that's something you might think of, when you see drugs where you have to take it either 3 times a day or 2 times a day or every 24 hours. That is all calculated based on the pharmacokinetics of knowing how quickly it takes that drug to leave the body. Let's see, and the next thing that has to be presented to the FDA are actually these clinical protocols describing very clearly what the study design will be and what the safety measures will be in initiating that study design. So again, I think we're seeing this, rightfully so, this important theme of safety first. The other thing that the IND needs to contain is something called an investigator's brochure, and this can be something very, very lengthy and dense to read, but is chock full of really, really important information because it contains everything that investigators might need to know in order to conduct a safe and appropriate clinical trial. So everything that's been known and tested and produced about this drug up until then that a researcher or investigator might need to know must be included in this brochure. And it's an extremely, extremely important and almost sacred document in drug trials. So what I'm going to do now is talk about the different phases of clinical trials. I'm waiting to see if there aren't any questions, so I'll move forward. So there are 4 phases to clinical trials, and one of the phases can be broken down into subparts, so I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But the first phase after an IND is accepted is a phase 1. What a phase 1 clinical trial is solely to assess the safety of a drug. So this is a phase in which can last several months. It can be longer, and a drug is tested, or again, a device or a procedure is tested in healthy volunteers. And what's determined is while there may be some idea of how the drug is broken down and acts in animals and cells, this determines the precise kinetics of how this drug breaks down in humans. So again, how is the drug absorbed? How's it broken down in the body? And how's it excreted? Another important aspect of phase 1 trials is to look at safety. So are there any adverse events? So as you can imagine why this is, all of these trials are critical. These phases are critical, but critical for different reasons. So this first phase is really to see what is the safety of this drug in healthy humans, and what side effects might come up. If the phase 1 data is gathered and assessed and approved as appropriate by the FDA, a phase 2 trial can then be applied for. So phase 2 trials do something different. They take it the next step. So what a phase 2 trial is supposed to do is to test the efficacy of a drug in a particular targeted disease or condition. In other words, can we see a clinical effect for a symptom of that condition? Phase 2 trials can last for a short period of time to a very long period of time. And this is the phase at which studies are often randomized, as I mentioned, placebo-controlled and blinded. So to try to prevent any bias in a study whatsoever, because you want to get pure and true information to see that this drug is working. And about 1/4 of all experimental drugs that get to the phase 2 trial will successfully move on to phase 3. I mentioned before that one of the phases can be broken down into 2 parts. More and more, phase 2 is being divided into 2 subphases. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the terminology of what this means, because this can be a little bit confusing. So phase 2A are sometimes considered to be pilot trials. So what you do is test the efficacy and safety in a small group of patients with a condition to be treated. And there can be multiple aspects of this, looking at safety, looking at does it have a clinical effect, and also looking and seeing is the dosing appropriate for the population that has whatever disease is going to be targeted. Phase 2Bs are more and more being considered pivotal trials. So typically these are the most rigorous demonstration of a medicine's efficacy. This is where the endpoints are really completely refined to show that a medication has a clinical effect. There's also a safety aspect in phase 2B, as there's safety aspects in all of these trials, but this is the one that's moving the study drug closer to approval. And now to phase 3. So phase 3 is the final clinical trial phase before a drug or device or procedure can reach approval for marketing. And what this does is provides investigators in the FDA with the most complete information about a drug's effectiveness and possible adverse reactions. And at this point, because as I mentioned, the phase 2A, in particular the phase 2B, are really considered oftentimes the most rigorous and the pivotal trials. At this point, once a drug has reached phase 3, about 70 to 90% of these studies are successful, and the FDA will approve the drug for marketing. And then clinical trials also has a phase 4, and this is what's considered to be a post-marketing surveillance trial. And these are, in my mind, just as important as all of the phases that have led up to the clinical trial, because what this is essentially a continuous monitoring of the new drug to make sure there aren't any undue adverse events or effects that come up that really weren't seen in those clinical trials. And there can be various reasons for this, but it's something that is really a service to those taking new drugs and using new devices to be assured that this is being consistently monitored for safety, and that the public will be alerted if something unexpected will come up. And findings in phase 4 studies can result in a drug or device being taken off the market or restricted for use. So I found this little image here from Nature Reviews Drug Discovery. I thought it was just something extremely well-ordered and neat to look at, that reviews a lot of what I discussed with you earlier. And since I know this presentation is being recorded, I just wanted this to be available for everybody to look through. But this really just shows the process, the stepwise process that drugs and devices and medications go through in order to reach marketing and post-marketing. Keep clicking the wrong button. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is typically the time difference between the end of phase 3 and the drug available on the market? That's actually an interesting question. My personal experience with this is it can take some time once a phase 3 trial ends for all of the data to be analyzed and published and discussed with the FDA. So it's still a process that can take more than a year. Let's see. So there are a lot of important considerations in designing a clinical trial, and designs for every clinical trial is going to be different, really based on what the goals are, what the endpoints are. But the things that are really most important in how to design a clinical trial is that the study must take safety into consideration first and foremost. And that's a mandate of the FDA, and again, of the way IRBs think about studies and the way researchers should be thinking about studies. The study must avoid all potential areas of bias. You need to know in the purest sense, is this drug or device or procedure doing what it's supposed to be doing without being biased in any way? Something that's very important and actually tends to trip up a lot of people looking to do clinical trials is that a study has to have measurable endpoints. So in other words, there has to be something that is measured that proves that that drug is working. And not only that, that thing that is being measured has to have been accepted, published, and proven, and something that the FDA, in other words, accepts as a measurable endpoint. So in other words, I can't just come to the FDA and say, I've decided that my endpoint is that my patients can bounce a ball 50 times against a wall rather than 20 times against a wall, because this isn't anything that's been published, accepted, or proven. So there are processes actually for getting measurable endpoints accepted and proven, but usually the first step to that process is actually publishing natural history studies to understand what is considered something to be measured in a condition, if that makes any sense. And the study has to be designed in a way that allows for statistical analysis. And really what that means is, in looking at the study design, statisticians work with researchers to determine something called the power of a study. In other words, in order to reach statistical significance, which is something we call a p-value, that measures the value of that statistical significance, how many people do you need to have participate in a trial that would see an effect that you would expect, and what would you do? How many people would you need to get that statistical significance? So again, back to the ball bouncing example. So say that I knew that I needed to see 20 people have an improvement in bouncing a ball against a wall to go from 20 to 50, and that's what would show me clinical significance. Then that's how many statistical significance, that's how many people I would enroll in a trial. Does that make sense? I think I'm waiting to see if there's any questions, because that part can be a little bit confusing. So numbers for individuals enrolled in a clinical trial is far from arbitrary. These are well thought out and well ascribed conditions that are set up pretty early to see a specific effect. So now let's talk about what happens at individual study sites. So while all of those things are going on at the FDA and all those approvals are going on among that group of individuals, there are separate approvals that go on to assure that the rights and welfares of research participants are being completely and totally protected. So this is something called an investigational review board, known as an IRB, and every academic institution and private institutions as well. No need to read openly. So investigational review board, I'm sorry, I'm just reading a question that came up. So an investigational review board is responsible for reviewing a study at each site and determining if that study is acceptable to that particular site. So this is another level of review. And as I mentioned, the IRB is made up of a group of experts who are formally designated to approve, monitor, and review research involving humans. So there are different review boards that look at animal research and those sorts of things, but this is these IRBs are solely reserved for protecting the rights and welfares of humans participating in research. Depending on the study site, the IRB boards can be made up of different groups of people, but generally it's a multidisciplinary team that includes physicians, nurses, ethicists, community members, and others who are trained to assess clinical trials. And they'll look at study protocols, what are the participants being asked to do. They'll look at study documents. What recruitment documents are we handing out to the patients? Can they be seen in any way as being coercive? Can they be seen as being biased? Is essentially what we're telling people fair. They assess patient safety. And they also really pay attention to procedures that assure patient confidentiality. So is the data being protected in a way that people cannot be identified and have their personal information identified during the study? And the other thing that IRBs do that I'm not sure that a lot of people are aware of is that they actually have an ongoing review throughout the course of the study. So it's not just the fact that they review the study initially, but they expect regular reports. And anyone working with an IRB should be aware that they can actually, in a completely unannounced way, come and review your study, which keeps researchers on their toes, knowing that at any point their documents can be examined. So this is something that's really important, that keeps us straight and keeps us on the sticking to the rules. So again, as I mentioned, the IRB is not just there for a one-time study approval. They really have a huge role in ongoing monitoring, and in an ongoing way, they continue to monitor that patient confidentiality is being protected. They'll continue to monitor ongoing risks and benefits. So if a study's going on and something changes about risks associated with the drug, they're going to want to know immediately and decide if they feel that the trial can still continue. They continue to monitor recruitment strategy and make sure that you're sticking to that strategy that you originally agreed upon, that you're not doing anything, again, to coerce patients or convince patients or participants. They want to know that this is being done in a straight up way. They make sure that the study is being documented properly, that documentation is not being altered or lost or misplaced or mishandled in any way. They make sure that informed consents are being handled in an ethical manner. In other words, how we're discussing the trial with our patients and asking for them to participate, they make sure that this is done in an ethical manner. They monitor the study progress. So at our institution, for example, periodically the IRB will ask for study reports. What's going on? What are the outcomes? What are the statistics? Have you published anything? And if nothing's going on, they're going to ask you why. And safety monitoring, as I mentioned, is an extremely critical part of what they do. The next thing that happens is once a study has gotten through the FDA to undergo a specific phase of a trial and through that lengthy IRB process, and IRB processes for clinical trials involving new drugs can take months and months and months while all the issues are settled and discussed. Study site preparation begins, and this is something that can take another 3 to 6 months after the institutional IRB has already been approved. So many larger academic institutions have their own individual clinical trial units. And what these units do is they review, again, another level of review, the research protocol to make sure that they feel that it's safe, that it's ethical, and that it's something that can be reasonably carried out at that institution, and that can take some time. And once that clinical trial unit protocol is approved, all of the members of a clinical trial team are expected to undergo good clinical practice training. That means it can be either in person or online training to understand exactly the most appropriate way to manage clinical trials, to manage data, to manage reporting, to manage everything that we do as part of a clinical trial. Once that has all been done, what happens next is a site initiation meeting. And that's the part where things start really getting excited for researchers at a site, because you sit down as a team with all of the different members of your team, and at that point, you make your immediate plans to get ready to enroll in the study. Pretty shortly after that, what happens is the study opens, meaning that potential participants can be recruited and enroll in that study. So I want to discuss a little bit about what are the aspects of enrollment for study participants. So the first thing is something called recruitment. And recruitment really means how potential study participants learn that a study is occurring that they may be eligible for. And there are various ways that participants can be recruited. One of the more common ways is that people recruit their own patients, so patients that are already seen by them and they're known to have a specific condition or be eligible for a specific trial. And the researcher or clinician will contact that person and say, I have this clinical trial, I know you have this condition, are you interested in participating? There can be advertisements, so things like flyers or listserv postings or advertisements on websites. And there can also be postings on clinicaltrials.gov and other things. But the important thing to realize is that recruitment process and everything that happens under that recruitment process has to be done in an approved way so that everything is being upheld to the highest ethical standards possible. And this is something that IRBs take extremely seriously. Once a potential appropriate study participant has received that recruitment message and thinks that they might be interested in that study and contacts the researcher, a consent process happens. So in this consent process, there is a thorough discussion of risks, benefits, and procedures associated with the clinical trial. This is something that needs to be done with the highest level of quality. Participants need to be able to take their time to read through a study consent, no matter how long it is. It needs to be in a primary language that person can understand. So they can't be expected to sign a consent for a study that they only half understand what's written in the consent. And there cannot be any salient points really missing out of that. Every risk, every potential risk, benefit, and all the procedures have to be thoroughly discussed. And that consent then has to be witnessed, depending on the trial itself, by one or two individuals involved in the study. After a consent is signed, it is copied, and the participant should always receive a copy of that consent, so they can always go back and review exactly what they signed. And if there are ever any questions, there should be information on that consent so they can contact the clinical team. In consents, there also should be information about the IRBs, so any individuals who have questions about the study site's approval or the study can contact that IRB independently. And let's see. Okay, so this is just an interesting note that I wanted to make, is that really questions about a study really should be, so if questions come up about recruitment, consent, and eligibility about a study, those questions should really be posed to the principal investigator and to the study coordinator, just to be sure that a steady, appropriate stream of information is coming out from the right sources, because you can imagine misinformation getting out, whether it be good or bad, can really be detrimental to a study. And the other thing to know is that when someone receives a recruitment message or a recruitment email or sees something on a listserv, that cannot be altered in any way and sent out to the community. Not only can that get the researchers and the investigators into some difficulty, it can also be misleading for people receiving that information. So I just wanted to note that, again, any questions, any concerns, any need for further information should come from the individuals running that trial. And so the last thing about enrollment for study participation is eligibility. And this is something that really I can see can be quite difficult, because what eligibility does is really to talk to the potential participant, to learn about their medical history, to learn about their condition, and to determine if it's safe for them to enroll in that study. So that's what's called enrollment criteria. This could include things like needing a clear confirmation that someone actually has a diagnosis, knowing if they're on medications that might have interactions with the study drug, concerns about the safety for that person. And in fact, it's possible that somebody might be doing so well or so healthy that they actually can't meet study criteria because there's nothing to improve, which is frankly quite a good problem to have, I think. But it can be really quite frustrating for individuals who earnestly want to participate in a clinical study to go through the process of recruitment and consent and then find out that at that point they're not eligible. But that's really done with the best interest of the participant in mind. So I just want to discuss briefly what happens after individuals are recruited and then consented and then meet eligibility criteria and are enrolled in a study. This slide, I found this a little bit difficult to make because study protocols really vastly vary from study to study depending on what the outcomes are and what the drug is. But really what the study protocol is what the participants are doing in order to test whether or not a drug works. So that includes things like taking the drug, having height and weight measured, having all the outcomes measured at periodic times, answering quality of life questionnaires, answering health questionnaires, all the things that are done to determine whether or not that drug works. The study protocol itself, so what we are expecting and asking of participants to do, is something that requires both the FDA and the IRB approval, and it's sites that have a clinical research unit. It can have to be approved by that clinical research unit. At Johns Hopkins, there are actually additional approval sites, so different departments who are participating in the same clinical trial will want to undergo their own approvals. And so protocols can't move forward unless essentially everybody who's participating is completely on board with what's going on. Many studies have something called rolling admission, meaning not everybody has to start the study at the same time. While the study itself, say a study will last 6 months, people can enroll January, February, March, April, but they will finish at different times, in other words. So not everybody has to start the study on the same day. And you can imagine that would be quite difficult to do anyway. And a study protocol can include research activities at a study site, so at a hospital or a clinic, or can include study and research activities at home. So not everything has to be done at a study site. And then the last thing is results reporting. And again, this is something that really varies from study to study, but once a study is completed, the results are unblinded. In other words, you then learn not until everything is completely done and everyone has completed the study and everyone has gone through all of the actions of the study. At that point, when it's done and closed, the results are unblinded, and finally you can analyze and see if that drug worked. So you can imagine the anxiety of everybody involved finally when they get to look at the information and see, did this do what we were hoping it would do? Results should always be reported whether the drug or device works or doesn't work. So everybody should know exactly the outcome of what they just participated in, both for the benefit of everyone who participated in that trial and for the general medical and research community to know whether something works or not. Something that's also important to know is all of the safety monitoring that's going on throughout the course of a trial. If there are concerns from an IRB, from the FDA, from the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, from the investigators themselves, a study can be stopped at any time and unblinded for any unanticipated reason. So that's something that's important to know, that it doesn't mean that just because something gets started, it will be seen through all the way until the end, because there are considerations that when you worry that there might be a concern that was unanticipated. So a question just came up about compassionate use of drugs if a drug is thought to be beneficial. So this is something that's a little bit of a different process. I've only been through this once, so I can speak a little bit to my personal experience. This is a situation in which a patient is in an extreme situation and there is a potential medication that might help that extreme situation. And so what a clinician or a researcher does is then approach the FDA with, sometimes the way we did it was a single-use IND, explaining what the situation was, explaining there was a drug in a various phase of a clinical trial that wasn't quite ready for marketing or not for that indication, and the FDA can actually approve that use in that compassionate situation and will monitor the outcome. So that's a little bit different than the process that I described here. That compassionate use is not something that will typically lead to marketing approval. It's sort of its own different track. That information should also be made public and published so that we understand what the potential outcomes of the medication are. I hope that answered that question. And it looks like I'm just about wrapping up, but I definitely want to take the time to answer as many questions as possible. These are really, really particularly helpful websites. I spend a lot of time rooting around in here, learning what I can about various clinical trials, about who's involved in what, about what different study protocols are. So this is www.clinicaltrials.gov. This is a wonderful website that is a registry and database of results of it should be all clinical trials involving human participants around the world. And it's a very easy website to use. You go, there's a search bar, and you can type in everything from a specific drug to a specific disease, to a specific researcher, and learn everything about that condition. And there are tabs that you can follow to learn about eligibility, enrollment criteria, whether the study in fact is recruiting. It's an extremely helpful registry. And another site that I really, really personally like, and I'm glad we're recording this because I know this is a hard one to write down. There's a lot of letters in this and a lot of dashes. But the NIH has a really nice summary of a lot of what I spoke about, but also with some further detail that talks about different study terminology. So it gets into even more terms than I mentioned in the beginning. Tips for research participants. So how to pick a good clinical trial, how to think about a good clinical trial, how to pick a good researcher, and how to get involved with clinical research. And then there's a lot of other general information, things like how to contact people at the NIH if there are questions or concerns, and all sorts of other really, really good information. And I'd also personally spend a lot of time rooting around on that website as well. So thank you for being here this evening and for listening to this primer on clinical trials. I'm happy to take any questions now or any questions by email. My email address is here, and I do my best to respond to emails as fast as I can. And again, I'm happy to answer anything. So let's see. Oh, so a question came up. Can you be enrolled in more than one trial at the same time? That depends on the enrollment criteria. So typically many questions, so typically trials are not going to want an individual to be enrolled in two separate drug intervention trials at the same time. But if one of these is a device trial or a procedure trial and the other is a drug trial, that may be okay. Honestly, it really depends on the enrollment and eligibility criteria. So that's something that could be specific to the trial. I see there's another question coming up, so I'm just going to wait here and see what comes up. Thank you.
We have a hand raised, and I'm trying to get to the person, and I can't figure it out. Amy, you have your hand raised. Sheila, you do too. If you could type your questions in.
And there's an important question here that it says, is it possible when we can have a discussion about the specific trial we're interested? I know this is painful. I totally understand, and I wish this was something I could have a webinar about. The best thing to do is to, for the specific trials that some of us are interested in discussing, following the IRB protocol means it's something that we individually will need to discuss on the phone. And I'm happy to have that discussion myself 90 times over and more. So for please, if you have questions, email me, contact me, and we will have that phone conversation per our IRB accepted protocol.
And they can call you at any point now. Is that correct? Any point, and you can have an individual conversation with them.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's just specific regulations about presenting things to a group.
Okay,
and there's important reasons for that. There really are very, very important reasons for that I'm aware, that I definitely agree with.
And there are two questions that had just come up.
So since it is a long process, how are clinical trials funded? That is a key question for those of us in the academic world, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and how much of the burden would fall on the Barth Syndrome Foundation. So how are clinical trials funded? There are, and I actually was thinking about putting a slide in this, and I thought it just sort of might get to be a little bit overwhelming, but there are multiple ways that clinical trials are funded. They are extremely expensive. So if you look up studies from preclinical all the way to approval, it's millions and millions upon millions of dollars, even for small studies. So oftentimes, studies are funded either through academics, through an academic grant. So someone applies to a program at the FDA where they have an interesting drug but might not have the money to move it forward, and they will then receive that grant to move forward. There are industry-sponsored trials. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an academic aspect, but it means there can be an academic and industry partnership where they work together to write a study and think about a study. And then the industry group, the company or the biotech company, will then fund that trial within an academic institution. And that's becoming more and more common as time goes on, because recognizing that we really have to work together to move these things forward. We can't exist in silos. The question, how much of the burden would fall on the Barth Syndrome Foundation? So that depends on the study and the trial, but I believe with the costs, it's hard for me to say. Honestly, it really depends on the individual trial itself. But I think the board can speak better to the fact that it's against the policy to support any one specific trial. I don't want to get too much into this. I would ask the board about this, but I think that's all I'm going to say there. And then, did that answer your question?
The question would be, I guess the question is the burden for recruitment or for payment? And I don't know what that would be, but the recruitment is really on the investigator. So we will share information about trials to our community, and we have a website where we have a process that we go through before an announcement goes out to the community, and then we do our best to keep people informed about the recruitment process, and we work very closely with the investigator to find out where we are with this. But again, this goes back to anything specific about the study really has to go to the investigator. Specific questions go to the investigator. I hope that answers that question.
And in a rolling study, do you get the results at the end or when you're done? So no, unfortunately, results are only released for these studies at the very, very end when everybody's done and everybody's complete, and then the results are then unblinded. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the main one is it's another source of internal bias of influencing results if people find out early if they were on the drug or not on the drug. So yep, at the very end when everybody finds out at the same time. Any other questions? I'm happy to keep going, so please let me know. Okay, here's another one. Is there a waiting period for a drug trial if you have been on a previous drug trial already? That is trial dependent, so that's part of the enrollment criteria. That's part of the eligibility criteria, so that is, again, study dependent. I believe when you go to clinicaltrials.gov and look up any of the studies, you can look for that eligibility criteria, and it might give you that bit of information. And if not, you can always contact the individual researcher. Let me look down here. I see a little message to me, and I will definitely take care of that. And let's see, anything else? Shelley, you getting anything?
I'm not seeing any other questions. If anybody is typing and in the process of typing a question, if you can just raise your hand now so we know that you're in the midst of typing a question, that would be helpful. Okay, it looks like I don't see any other questions, but again, I just want to stress that, again, if you have a question about a particular trial that we know is coming up, and Dr. Vernon is more than happy to discuss this by phone or by email with you. And I can't stress enough that questions really should be posed to her, regardless of how simple it may seem when it comes to inclusion and exclusion criteria. She can explain things, or the investigator can explain things.
Absolutely, and also there's nothing that anyone could possibly ask that would in any way, what's the word? Just don't worry. I guess the best thing is don't worry about asking me anything, no matter how it may come across. Whether you're worried about offending or worried about asking personal questions, just anything that comes across. I'd rather answer the question up front and give you the right answers than have answers come from inappropriate sources. So I'm happy to answer anything.
Could you go over a little bit more about the difference? So you've got the principal investigator, and then you have industry. So you have industry, and they are kind of at arm's distance, and they may be sponsoring a trial, but the questions again or discussions are between the investigator, but also the coordinator. So what is the role with the coordinator? Are they just the person who organizes the appointments or enrolls people, or can you go a
Yeah,
little bit into that?
sure. So it's difficult to speak to every trial because trials are run differently. But my it's hard to get I don't want to be too specific about my own study, but oftentimes the way that industry sponsored trials works is more of a partnership. So it's sort of a sponsor and a researcher working together to design a trial, and then the researcher carries out that trial and the sponsor essentially stays out of it while the trial is going on. So they don't influence the outcome of the study in any way. So then essentially working under the auspices of the study, but working independently from the sponsor at that point, the research team carries out the study. The principal investigator is, again, the one who takes responsibility for the activities of what's going on at that study site. So they're taking responsibility for patient safety, for adverse events, to taking responsibility for compliance, everything that's going on, and taking responsibility for the actions of their study team. The study coordinator is part of that study team, but that's sort of the person you would consider as your contact on the study for any and all questions and concerns. They can manage scheduling, they manage times, they manage essentially every day-to-day question comes up. That is your key person to help solve those questions. Let's see. Do we have any doctors or researchers in the Barth syndrome community who have been on an IRB? Oh, you mean individuals who themselves have served on IRB committees to look at safety data? Is that the question? I want to be sure I understand. Yes. So I'm sure it's really common for people in academic, sort of in the academic setting, to serve on an IRB at one time or another. So, and considering all of the academic folks that we have, both on the SMAB and in the Barth syndrome community, I am sure people have served on IRBs. And I myself actually have reviewed multiple studies for the FDA. It's just something that's part of our activities as academics and as clinicians in the community. I'm waiting to see if anybody's typing.
I don't think so. I think that everybody has done. We've got a lot of people saying thank you.
Oh,
And
it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thanks for being here on a late Thursday night.
Very helpful. I think this will help us as we go through this. And again, there are questions, just any question that you may have during the conference. Kate offered a very good talk. She gave a very good talk about the processes of clinical trials, and questions, simple questions about how long does this take, or how any question that you have, again, really needs to be addressed to the investigator, and that's a part of making an informed decision about whether you want to enroll or not. And all, as Dr. Vernon says over and over and over again, that participation in research is totally voluntary. So we want to make sure that you're as informed as possible when you make the decision to enroll in a study. And there is one more question that I had about not recruitment, but to compliance and retention is also something. I don't remember you addressing that, but when people enroll, the percentage of retention in a study is, so if you enroll 10 people, is it likely that all of those 10 people that are going to enroll in a study are going to complete it, be compliant, and be retained in it?
I mean, that's really difficult. That's a really difficult thing to answer. So some studies that I've recently reviewed, with 30 people enrolled, 29 stayed compliant. But it really varies. In some eligibility criteria, it is written in there that part of the eligibility criteria is that someone feels that they can carry out the study actions or the study activities, but it can be hard. It can be hard. And we recognize, I mean, we really recognize, as much as it's a commitment on our part, it's more of a commitment on the participants' part, because they're really giving time and effort to what's essentially research, not essentially, but is research, trying to figure out if something's going to work. And then, Shelley, you said something that that struck something in my mind that I just wanted to mention. That as part of the consent process, any consenting clinician, whether it's your doctor or someone who's involved in your care, they need to be sure that they tell you nothing about your participation or non-participation will in any way affect your care at that institution. It's just really important that that's a clear message, that whomever, it's a personal decision to participate in the clinical trial, and it should not and will not change your clinician's opinion of you or your family or your healthcare if you participate or don't participate. So I just wanted to make sure that message is also completely clear.
Well, I think this has been great. And again, if you have questions about the study, contact Dr. Vernon. If you have questions about tonight's call, we've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to.
That's a lot of info.
Yeah, it is a lot of information, but I'm going to get this together. And as soon as I'm able to get it up on the internet, I'll send an announcement out. And I would encourage people to watch this again and to listen to this again. And please don't hesitate to contact Dr. Vernon about this, because this is something that we need to know as we move forward, and we're in very exciting times that we are now at the point of even talking about clinical trials. So thank you, Dr. Vernon, for leading this discussion. I appreciate it a great deal. And we'll talk to everybody soon. I don't think there's any more questions, and so I'll bid you all good night.
Good night.
Good night.